threat. Really, y'all don't know this, y'all in danger. I'm a threat. I'm a gamble with your life, cause you know that it's a bet. It's a bet. You know I ain't letting up, my foot is on your neck. Yeah, take my word for it, it's a promise and a threat. Really, y'all don't know this, y'all in danger. I'm a threat. I'm a gamble with your life, cause you know that it's a bet. It's a bet. You know I ain't letting up, my foot is on your neck. Yeah, take my word for it, it's a promise and a threat. I ain't never really wanna flex my gifts, but I think it's my time, let me check my wrist. You can never get my shine, I'ma keep on grinding till I reach the top.
What's up? How's everyone doing? Welcome to Simple Shit TV. I'm your host, Alvin Holden, also known as Project 8020. And we're doing something kind of crazy today. We're talking about slave farms. Alvin, what are you talking about, slave farms? Well, there is a very important part of American history that is often left out that would explain a lot of the behaviors of the African American people in this country. And I think that I want to help you fill a couple of gaps. What's up, Wrench Turner? What's up, bro? Once again, I thought I'd be in here by myself. But look, here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. This is an educational channel, first and foremost. I'm here just to inform. Simple Shit TV, what we're doing is trying to keep really big, complex situations and things. We're going to bring them down to bite-sized, itty-bitty pieces so that everyone can digest them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start nice and slow, and then we'll get into the main part of the what's up, Volcanus? What's up, Rich man? Hey, first and foremost, all of you that are watching me right now, that are live in the chat, I appreciate you so much. I can't lie, I was dreading doing this all day long. This is the most nerve-wracking thing I've ever done in my life, but I'm gonna do it anyways. I'm gonna muscle through. So salute to all of you gentlemen. Thank you so much. We're gonna use this word a lot, slave, and I want to start by really kind of breaking this down just a little bit, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And what I think I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to make it as big as I possibly can. Hold on, guys. All right, so there we go. I don't know if it's dark enough for you. Basically, a person who is legal property of another and is forced to obey them. Let's go on ahead and find our Webster's dictionary. A person held in forced servitude. A person who is completely subservient to a dominating influence. And then, of course, there's a device such as a printer or computer that is directly responsive to another. And the interesting thing about that is that the current idea of what that word means is closer to how you would use your computer or a printer, it being a slave device. Let's continue. And like I said, the reason why I wanted to start this way is because we're going to use this word a lot. And I believe that it's easy to say, oh, well, there's no whips, there's no chains, there's not intentional servitude. And I would agree with you to say that what is happening now is equivalent to slavery back in the day. Chattel slavery back in the day would also be hyperbolic, as they say. But what I'm trying to tell you is that a lot of the practices are the same. We've gotten more civilized per se, but the practices never changed. And we're going to explore a lot of that today. So slave farms, chattel slavery. See, one of the differences between American slavery and slavery in other parts of the world is that you had an opportunity to earn your way out of slavery. The idea that you were born into slavery and would be a slave your entire life is actually an American thing. That's not a worldly or international thing. And part of the whole issue with the Constitution and what they wrestled with the Constitution in the late 1700s, early 1800s was the fact that Black people were born into servitude and were made to be slaves their entire existence and their offspring. That is the biggest difference, the difference between the slavery that the rest of the world knows and the difference between this chattel slavery. This is the American version of slavery. Okay. Now, all that being said, again, I think most folks don't really understand the fact that slavery in this country was drastically different than what it was in other countries. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on to this. There's a video that I'm going to play with you guys. We're going to watch this together. And essentially what this is this kind of gives us a surface level explanation as to what the slave farms were, because I think that there is a huge economic element that is being played that never gets spoken of, which is why things are the way they are. And when I say why things are the way they are, I also mean why our women, African-American women, seem to be separate from us. They seem to not have the same connection to us as we do to them, right? And so all I'm simply going to do is say, instead of trying to explain all of it, I'm simply going to introduce some concepts to you that you may or may not have known. So join me. This might be a little bit slow. I'm going to jump in when I feel it makes a little bit of sense. Let's get this bad boy started. All right. So let's just bear with me on this one for a little bit. Let's see if we can get some volume.
United States. The key players in the politics of formative America at the time show us this. President Thomas Jefferson was a renowned slaver, siring 6 children with the woman he owned, Sally Hemings, and Virginia native, well aware of...
All right. So we're going to try this again. For all you guys that held on, I appreciate you. You guys are the shit. I swear you can do as many practice runs as you possibly can, and it's still going to end up messing up for you. Anyways, like I was saying, there's a economic element that I don't believe people really pay attention to. Thomas Jefferson is what he's speaking on right about now. As I play this, I want you to think about how many white folks you know whose last name is Jefferson, and how many Black folks you know as being Jefferson. Jefferson being one of our founding fathers, and I absolutely positively do not know a single white person whose last name is Jefferson. They are all Black. Let's just keep that in mind. Let's let this rock for a minute. Hopefully this plays for me.
Across the 18th century in America, steadily degraded and destroyed any personhood an enslaved individual had. This process most pointedly took the enslaved from personhood to thinghood, leaving all rights belonging to the owner of the slave and not the person in slavery. As this ideology and culturizing took hold, the sale and purchasing of slaves became accepted, with no objection from American society or its people. There is little altruism to be found in the action of prohibiting slave importation to the United States. The key players in the politics of formative America at the time show us this. President Thomas Jefferson was a renowned slaver, siring 6 children with the woman he owned, Sally Hemings, and Virginia native, well aware of the economic backbone slavery was to the South. Far from the end of importing slaves creating the spark to fire up abolition, the decrease of external slave supplies meant the value of domestic slaves would rise.
Did you catch that part? Did you catch that part? That's the part right there. That part right there. Let's play that part again.
backbone slavery was to the South. Far from the end of importing slaves creating the spark to fire up abolition, the decrease of external slave supplies meant the value of domestic slaves would rise. People had become products along with being the means of production.
The value of domestic slaves would
Virginia,
rise.
Jefferson State, would become the leading state in the production of slaves. Over time, the sale of slaves...
The production of slaves, meaning that since you couldn't bring them over anymore, they were growing them here. So they were growing people here in the United States. Now, that sounds crazy. But essentially, that was when they started bringing women over. So there was a full 200 years of slavery in this country before they brought women over. Why? Because there was no need for us to reproduce before the time that we're speaking of. This is the late 1800s all the way up into 1807. Let's continue.
Slaves became its leading...
What if digital could help your organization change?
I'm just going to let this rock. Of course, commercials. All right.
At the turn of the 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade was coming to its end. In Britain, William Wilberforce led a movement made up of Quakers and evangelicals to set up the Committee for the Abolition of Slave Trade. Come 1807, the Parliament of Britain passed the Slavery Trade Act, and the turn of the tide in colonial Britain increased calls for the abolition of slavery in America.
Now, this is the part they never talk about. So what was happening was the United States was kicking the shit out of Europe. This is where we were getting all of our GDP. We were selling tobacco, we were selling cotton. We had all the resources, and essentially Europe was like, you know what, we're going to go ahead and stop this slave trade. I believe it was economic issues that made them want to stop trade, not necessarily they had a moral issue with slavery. It was because the United States was getting a leg up because of the act or the practice of slavery. So at that point is when we figured out, okay, Europe wasn't going to allow us to ship any slaves back over again. We need to grow our own slaves here. That's when they started to focus on bringing women over and focusing on the women here so that they can have slave children. This again is the biggest point, being born into servitude. This is the rub. I think this is the point that I think a lot of people don't really understand.
At this time, the economics of slave labor and its produce was only growing in America. The production of sugarcane, cotton, and rice, particularly in the Deep South and Western America, were lucrative to the point of being viable political capital. Before the American Civil War, King Cotton was a phrase used to summarize the productive monopoly slave states had over abolitionist states in the North. This importance of cotton economically had secession states convinced there would not even be a chance of war with northern states. Yet, in the layered, complicated history of the United States, at a time when slave labor was at its most profitable for America, Congress and President Thomas Jefferson supported calls for abolition. From 1808, import...
Boom. Okay. So, economic powerhouse, starting to grow cotton, starting to grow sugar cane. We've got enough slaves to support all of the labor. Right? We've got free labor to grow all of these things, and we've got the natural resources to grow all of these things. Europe across the water is now outlawing slavery because they understand that we are getting free labor and we're getting ahead of them as far as GDP, gross domestic product. They don't like it. So their idea was, let's outlaw the Atlantic slave trade altogether so that the Americans can't continue to do the things that they're doing. Well, Thomas Jefferson, understanding how powerful our economy was becoming, says, you know what? We're going to go on ahead and grow our own. We'll outlaw the slavery. We'll stop the slave trade, so we won't let anyone else bring slaves in, but we're not going to stop slavery in this country. We're going to grow our own slaves here. They always leave that part out.
Importing slaves to America was prohibited as the cotton engine was invented and its production and demand for labor. Importing slaves to America was prohibited as the cotton engine was.
So they didn't stop slavery. They just stopped the importation of slaves, meaning the reason why they stopped the importation of slaves so that they could protect the ones that they were growing homegrown here. That's why they stopped the importation of slaves. So in 1808 is when they said, you know what? We're doing our own thing over here. We don't need to bring them over anymore. So let's go on ahead and put some legislation in place. So they actually punished those that would continue to smuggle slaves over from overseas because they wanted to deal with the slave farms that were here operating in this country as it was. Let's continue.
Was invented and its production and demand for labor only rose.
Breeding. Now, why is this part important? So what we've done is we've established the fact that slavery was happening in this country in the way that it wasn't because there was a moral compass that Europe had. It was because they didn't want to get behind as far as GDP and gross domestic product. They understood that we had free labor and that we had the ability to produce more products, a la tobacco, cotton, so on and so forth, at a very low price, and they had to buy it up from us. So we were getting ahead. We were creating this economic engine that Europe just couldn't compete with. Right? So they outlaw slavery, or at least they outlaw the slave trade. We say, okay, we can outlaw the slave trade. But while they're outlawing the slave trade, the United States set up their own slave farms so that we could grow our own people here, just like they do cattle, just like they do horses, just like they do pigs, chickens, everything else. Now let's get into the breeding part.
The 1808 Prohibition Act served as a great protection to the internal slave market, and slave owners doubled down. Quite chillingly, slave owners referred to breeding as a natural increase, despite
a natural increase. Now, remember that they said that. Like I said, if you look at the census from 1800 to 1860, 1865, they do it every 10 years. So it was 1800 to about 1860 or 1870. The population of the slave population in the United States grew 10 times, from 400,000 slaves to 4 million slaves at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I challenge anyone that happens to be listening to this right now. I've done it myself. You can't find any population growth that has been that fast in that short a time under natural circumstances. I tried, I looked from 400,000 in 1800 to 4 million slaves, 4 million people in 1865. There is not a single group that has grown in population on the planet that I've been able to find, not documented. Let's continue.
the clear management and collective efforts that went into it. In an utter tangle of priorities, Black women.
Damn commercials. So as this goes, let's go back. Here we
Became
go.
a rare
that,
pillar.
Let's do this because this is important.
Went into it.
This is important.
In an utter tangle of priorities, Black women enslaved in America became a rare pillar, receiving free health care, if not the very first.
Say that again. Hold on.
Clear management and collective efforts that went into it. In an utter tangle of priorities, Black women enslaved in America became a rare pillar, receiving free health care, if not the very first.
If not the very first to receive free health care. Black women, the first to receive free health care. Not white women. Black women were the first to receive free health care.
As termed by Ned and Constance Sublettet in their book The American Slave Coast, the enslaved woman's womb became capitalized. Fertility and its safeguarding became of the utmost importance to those in the slave trade.
Let's say that. Let's hear that again.
Slave Coast, the enslaved woman's womb became capitalized. Fertility and its safeguarding became of the utmost importance to those in the slave trade. It's understood that home medical journals began to be circulated to aid slaves through difficult births when the matter would have been previously disregarded. Black female slaves were expected to produce 4 to 5 children.
Hold on. Let's say
no
that
mistake.
again. Let's say that again. Hold on.
When the matter would have been previously disregarded. Black female slaves were expected to produce 4 to 5 children. Let there be no mistake. The high mortality rate of slaves was through difficult births when the matter would have been previously disregarded. Black female slaves were expected to produce 4 to 5 children. Let there be no mistake. The high mortality rate of slaves was a cornerstone of breeding's importance. Good breeding stock was commonly used to advertise a female slave for sale. Many women in these circumstances would have found themselves being continually bartered and incentivized by slave and plantation owners. It was
incentivized to do what exactly? Let's just
for
say that part
sale.
again.
Many women in these circumstances would have found themselves being continually bartered and incentivized by slave and plantation owners. It was not uncommon for an enslaved woman to have been posed an offer of freedom should she bear 15 children. The reality was a child as young as 12 to 13 could be forced into pregnancy and give birth to a child that would be taken from her only to be forced into a life of slavery. But people had become products under this system. The means were nothing short of dehumanizing.
Now, so what did that last part say? That said that Black women were one of the first to get free health care, even before white women. This is in the early 1800s. They were already the first. They were expected to have 4 to 5 children, at least. They were also offered their freedom if they could have up to 15 children. So they were already given preferential treatment by plantation owners and landowners, right? So there's already a culture of them being separate from the men, already treated differently than the men. They got health care before we got health care. They got offered things before we got offered things. If you actually look in the Willie Lynch letters, there's an important part where they say, never deal with the men. You always deal with the women, especially elderly men. You never deal with the elderly men. You deal with the elderly women. Let's continue.
Childbearing for women slaves would start as young as 13 years old. It's more than possible that 4 to 5 pregnancies would have been expected by the time she turned 20. Vulnerabilities faced by enslaved women in a system expecting breeding from them were multiple. It was not beneath this slave market of the 19th century America to sell women slaves during pregnancy. Many would contend that the life of a female slave in America would have been a cycle of rape, pregnancy.
So as this is going through, so the idea that you would use a Black woman's womb as a commodity is not a new thing. In fact, it's the oldest thing. They've been doing it from the beginning. So when women say, my child, and they treat this child like it's hers and not the father's, that's really how she feels. That's really how they feel. Culturally, that's what it was. There has been no mention of a man yet. There has been zero mention of the males. We're going to talk about the bucks here in a second, but there at this point in time, there was no mention of a relationship. There's no mention of a marriage. There was no mention of anything. There was slaves, there was women, and there was the amount of children they're supposed to have. That's it. That's it. There's zero talk of a relationship. Not even a little bit. Let's continue.
A cycle of rape, pregnancy, and uncared for birth. Recovery over a matter of just weeks
I'm going
before
to run that part back.
Factory America to sell women slaves during pregnancy. Many would contend that the life of a female slave in America would have been a cycle of rape, pregnancy, and uncared for birth. Recovery over a matter of just weeks before pregnancy was expected again. Masters and slave owners have been detailed in numerous accounts as fathering slaves themselves. With no rights and a legal blockage to any form of personhood, this system forcing children out of women can only constitute rape. Breeding farms held the inequality of white owners being legally protected, while their black counterparts had none. Sexual abuse would only be considered.
Now let's talk about that part for a split second. Okay. Well, did you hear what they just said? They said that so there was protections there are protections for the white men, basically for the white men being able to take advantage of their property. There was protections for them to do that, but there were no protections of black men if they happen to say mess with the old lady. Right? So I want to make sure that we got to drill that part down.
It would have been a cycle of rape, pregnancy, and uncared for birth. Recovery over a matter of just weeks before pregnancy was expected again. Masters and slave owners have been detailed in numerous accounts as fathering slaves themselves. With no rights and a legal blockage to any form of personhood, this system forcing children out of women can only constitute rape. Breeding farms held the inequality of white owners being legally protected, while their black counterparts had none. Sexual abuse would only be considered one way. Slave accounts reveal that it was commonplace for slave owners to be intrusive in the sex lives of their property.
All right. So let's see.
Arranged marriages and forced mating were part of the breeding culture that started in slavery.
Forced mating. Okay, now this is the part I wanted to get to that kind of demonstrates the disconnection between the men and the women, and why there isn't the type of connection between the two, why they don't see the legacy, like why they don't see why they should be connected to. Let's let it play. What's
regarded as chattel, the conditions of their breeding mirrored that of animals. Slave testimony includes the reference to stockmen. Stockmen were male slaves brought to farms to impregnate female slaves of their given owners. This importing of bucks became a theme throughout breeding. Slave owners looked to produce as many slaves capable of the hard physical labor of working fields. There is a famous study by economist Richard Stooch examining the farms of Virginia in 1860. Stunningly,
did you catch that?
Importing of bucks became a theme throughout breeding.
Who do the lovely ladies like? Right? They like the gangster, they like the buck, they like the alpha male, they like the biggest, baddest, biggest, nastiest swinging, thing on the plantation. That's who they want, right? They want to breed with them, but they don't necessarily want to stay with them. Right? So this behavior is not new. Slave
owners looked to produce as many slaves capable of the hard physical labor of working fields. There is a famous study by economist Richard Stooch examining the farms of Virginia in 1860. Stunningly, the ratio of female to male slaves was around 2 to 1.
The ratio of females to males was 2 to 1. because the women were more valuable because they could reproduce. What situation are we in right now? There's more women than men. It's not 2-1, but there are more women than men. Let's continue.
The study found in total that the amount of females outnumbering males was as many as 300,000. This would have solely been for the lucrative domestic breeding industry.
That's the important part right there. That's the juice right there.
Male-to-male slaves was around 2-1. The study found in total that the amount of females outnumbering males was as many as 300,000
more.
This would have solely been for the lucrative domestic breeding industry. The inherent racist ideology rooting slavery in America meant slave owners forcing their will on their slaves would have been thought righteous by many. Along with blindness to the systematic rape of the breeding farms, white owners felt their will would have been preferable to that of black slaves. House slaves faced the most danger of being victims of their master's rape. A consequence of this would be many childbearing slaves would shield their children from their master's wife for fear of revealing the father.
For fear of revealing the father. So in the off chance that grandma got taken advantage of by the plantation owner, she had to try to hide her children so that the plantation owner's wife wouldn't find out, knowing that he was sleeping with the slave. Like, you see how nasty it is? Because I always wondered where all these light-skinned black people came from. Where did all these light-skinned black people come from? Now we know.
The account of Harriet Jacobs, a house slave in North Carolina, attested that her master fathered as many as 11 slaves.
So what have we done? We've established
none of this factory.
So we've established that the women got benefits, where black women were the first to get benefits. We've established that. We've established up until this point, there's still no mention of relationship with black men, meaning no marriages, no relationships, no this, that, or the other things. They've only mentioned that they bring in bucks to mate, and that's it. So up until this point, there is no relationship with men and women together as being one unit. There's no family unit. There is no, you can get married, none of it at this stage of the game.
Breeding and abuse was for anything other than the reinforcement and strengthening of profit. Accounts include those in the slave trade remarking at the profitability of their breeding farms. A Virginia slave trader declared that the use of enforced breeding policies had brought him 6,000 slave children to sell.
6,000 slave children with the practices of forced paternity on his plantation. Let's run that back.
Declared that the use of enforced breeding policies had brought him 6,000 slave children to sell over a calendar year.
Wait, salute Roger Report. What's up, bro? Salute Cody Marshalls. 3/5. And you know what? Okay, so Cody, you make an interesting point. And the 3/5 part was also, again, I think sometimes we get caught up in the moral element of that whole part, okay? Do me a favor. This part is really important. The 3/5 part wasn't necessarily because they were like, oh, you're only 3/5 of a human being. It's a math problem. In some of those southern states, there was 5 times as many black people as there was white people in the state. So if they actually gave black people the right to vote, black people would control those states. So what they did was they took the number of slaves and they said, what's the number that we need to reduce this by so that they don't have enough voting power to ever get anything done? They landed on 3/5 because 3/5 was the number they needed to make sure that they could control the Congress and legislation. That's where the 3/5 part came from. So it wasn't just that, oh, you're only 3/5 of a person or you're half of a person. It was a math problem. It was an economic problem. This is why I was telling you before, this is why the census is so important, because they base a lot of our policy and where they spend the money on the census, based on how many Black people, how many white people, how many of these groups are actually in the country. So it's not that you were wrong on the three being 3/5 of human to them, but it's more of a math problem. See, I think what people are starting or don't really understand is that there is an economic issue here, that the North didn't just all of a sudden have some sort of a moral compass and say, you know what, I feel like, you know what, this is just bad and we shouldn't do this anymore. It was because there was 5 million slaves worth $1,000 a head down south. There was in Virginia, which was considered the South, the largest slave farms in the country that were producing more slaves than any other state. And you're going to find out here in just a second that the slave trade was more valuable than silver and gold combined, including cotton and tobacco. The slave trade itself, after they started shipping people in, is where the United States got all of its wealth. Let's continue.
Thomas Jefferson is alleged to have boasted that Virginia's capital raised 4% every year through the birth of Black children.
Did you hear that?
Once people were
let's play that
alleged
again.
to have boasted that Virginia's capital regulator declared that the use of enforced breeding policies had brought him 6,000 slave children to sell over a calendar year. Thomas Jefferson is alleged to have boasted that Virginia's capital raised 4% every year through the birth of Black children. Once people were considered to be
4%.
property, the money made from the industry developed and furthered. By the mid-1800s, the South's slave trade has been estimated as worth around $4 billion. This utterly dwarfs
$4 billion at that time. At that time. $4 billion. At that time, $4 billion. Let's run that back.
Been estimated as worth around $4 billion. This utterly dwarfs the national income in gold and silver, overall currency, and even southern farmland. The slavers had made
even the farmland, gold, silver, the farmland, the slave farms were that was the economic engine of the United States. That's how we made the money. $4 billion. And that's back then in the 1800s. They don't ever talk about this part. This is the most important part. This is what they went to war over. This is why they act the way they act. This is why our women are not connected to us. This is why the United States fights so hard to keep us in the condition that we're in, because I can draw a straight line from this time to this time right now. Let's continue.
Made slaves more valuable than they ever could have thought possible. Most shockingly, the slave trade over the opening decades of the 1800s took slaves from property to securities. The humanist side of taking people's personhood and reducing them to property has long been outlined in the history books. The legal side of turning people into property has been less explored, quite possibly for its stomach-turning consequence. Slave owners of the 1830s wanted more capital in their states and realized a way to do it through the lack of legal status any slave had, by mortgaging them.
By mortgaging them. This is where the banks get involved.
Banks were set up in informative southern states, including Louisiana and Mississippi, where slaves were mortgaged as properties to the banks. These mortgages were repackaged into bonds that could be sold globally. This meant many over the world where slavery had been outlawed were profiting from bonds backed by their value. In a sardonic twist, arguably, the prohibition of the slave trade ended up developing the financial roots it formed over an allegedly enlightened world.
So we're going to run some of that back. So what we have here is an entire economy that they've thrown a misdirection, right? It's a misdirection. It's the importance of the slave, the importance of the Black person in this country is pushed down and diminished so that we don't really understand how ugly the situation really was. Now, I'm going to break these down piece by piece in a separate video, but what I really wanted to get at is that this entire time, the slave trade wasn't just something that we did. It was the literal economic engine of the United States between all the way up until very, very recently. And even now, I can still draw a straight line between the type of things that they did then and what they do now. The way that the healthcare system works, the way that the slave farms were set up were essentially a lot like, in fact, here's what I'll do. Let's do this real quick. Let's see if I can get myself here. So the way that the slave farms were set up, they were set up a lot like what we see today as ghettos, where we see the where there's